panel, and we're going to have more than enough to talk about, so I don't want to delay in kicking off what's going to be a great discussion. My name is Rachel Oswald. Welcome to the National Press Club for those of you that are our guests. I am the vice chair of the Freedom of the Press Committee, and the committee every year likes to put together a slate of programming celebrating freedom of information in honor of Sunshine Week. So this is the final event of 3 events we did this week. We're going to be looking at freedom of information from the federal level, examining how well the Obama administration has done. Regrettably, we were going to be joined by the Obama administration's FOIA Ombudsman, Director James Holzer, but the metro shutdown did not allow him to come here. So regrettably, he's not going to join us, but I want you to know that we did try to have the administration represented, and so it was a good faith effort, but we hope to maybe do an event with the director or somebody else from his office in the future, and of course we will advertise that when it happens. So if you want to live tweet the event, by all means, the hashtag is NPCLive. We're also webcasting this, and I believe that's it for announcements. I'll just let our moderator, Christine Waltz, take it over and introduce the panel.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And thanks, everyone, for coming out and braving the traffic tonight. I apologize that we're getting started a few minutes late. It was wretched out there. As Rachel mentioned, my name's Christine Walls. I'm an associate at Holland & Knight in the firm's national media practice, and part of my practice includes access issues and representing reporters and news organizations with access issues. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel discussion. I think, as everyone knows, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Act, and President Johnson notoriously and reluctantly signed the bill in 1966 without holding a signing ceremony because he didn't want to draw public attention to the bill.
He wasn't necessarily in this photo pondering it, right?
No.
Okay.
This is illustrative.
Looks like when I send my FOIAs. I imagine.
It's illustrative. He didn't want to draw public attention to the bill. Notes from his files indicate that he edited the signing statement to try to limit the reach of the law. So, for example, he revised a sentence that said, democracy works best when people know what their government is doing, to instead read, democracy works best when people have all the information that the security of the nation will permit. So I think it's fair to say that since it was passed, this law has always had its critics within every presidential administration. And as Rachel mentioned, tonight our panel will focus on the state of FOIA at the end of the Obama administration, which, as we all know, campaigned on and came into office promising to be the most open and transparent administration the country's ever known. So we have a great panel pulled together here tonight to explore the issue. To my left, we have David Sobel from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. David is senior counsel in the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Washington, D.C. office, where he directs the organization's FOIA Litigation for Accountable Government, or FLAG, project. David's handled numerous cases seeking the disclosure of government documents on privacy policy, including electronic surveillance, encryption controls, and airline passenger screening initiatives. And then we have Mike Doyle from McClatchy. Mike is the legal affairs correspondent for McClatchy's Washington Bureau, covering the Supreme Court and other federal courts, and so he had a busy day today. He's worked as a reporter for the Bureau since 1988. And then to the far left is Jason Leopold from Vice News. Jason is an Emmy-nominated investigative reporter from Vice News, where he covers national security. Politico has identified him as perhaps the most prolific Freedom of Information Act requester. He has sued the FBI and the Department of Defense and forced the agencies to change their FOIA policies. He filed the FOIA request that forced the State Department to release Secretary Clinton's emails, which we'll discuss on the panel. And he forced the NSA for the first time to release all of the financial disclosure forms of its top officials. As Rachel mentioned, we had also hoped to have OGIS Director James Holzer with us tonight, but as a result of the Metro, he wasn't able to make it. We have done our best to try to incorporate some of those perspectives into the dialogue tonight, but if anyone has positive FOIA experiences that they'd like to share, please shout out. We'd love to hear it. One way I thought we'd get to know all the panelists is I've asked each panelist to think about what their first or most interesting FOIA experience was so that you understand their backgrounds a little bit more. So Mike, what do you have to say?
Well, my first FOIA experience, not technically my first, but my first meaningful one was for a former California congressman who passed away. And when he passed away, I figured the FBI would have a file on him. His name was John Moss, and he was the author of the Freedom of Information Act. When he died in 1997, I filed a FOIA. A year or so later, I got the response from the FBI. And it was entertaining. It was filled with nuggets. There was a March 31st, 1960 FBI memo that said, our relations have not been favorable with Congressman Moss. And there was a 1959 memo that pointed out that the congressman, this is before FOIA had even passed, but the FBI said the congressman was going to be speaking at the University of Arizona, probably would be saying things antithetical to the Bureau's interests, and it would be good to get an invitation to speak and counter Moss. So that was, as I say, not my first FOIA, but it was the first one that opened my eyes to how fun this act can be. In terms of the most interesting FOIA, it's like choosing your favorite child, but I would say one from 2007, and I'll preface it to go back to a point which Christine made. Prior to Johnson signing the act, his advisors, Secretary of HEW, Cyrus Vance, State Department, all recommended that he not sign it and raised serious concerns. The State Department sent a memo saying that if you open up access to information, it would open and encourage, quote, fishing expeditions by those motivated by nothing more than an idle whim or a capricious curiosity. So it was on a day when I was filled with capricious curiosity in 2007 that I filed a FOIA request with the Department of the Army. A Laotian general named Vang Pao had passed away. He had fought with the CIA in the Vietnam War. He died. His supporters wanted him buried at Arlington. He was denied that burial right. It became a little bit of a controversy. And literally, it was a slow day at the office, and I was just kind of curious about Arlington cemetery burial exemptions. So I filed a FOIA as an idle whim. Several weeks later, got the response, the best part of which was the lobbying campaign that it revealed by Hollywood's lobbyist, Jack Valente, big power player in Washington at the time, World War II veteran, desperate to get buried at Arlington. And the correspondence that I obtained showed how he was writing letters and emails and having lunches and leaning on members of Congress and sending notes to Rummy, Secretary Rumsfeld, talking about the importance of it. And it led to this lead. I still like this lead. Jack Valente won his final and most heartfelt lobbying victory when he was lowered into the ground at Arlington National Cemetery. So that was a case. I love that FOIA request because it was completely idle. It was simple curiosity, and I came up with something that was kind of fun.
Fantastic. What about you, Jason?
I would say that the most interesting FOIA experience I had, which opened my eyes up to how fun this would be, I found out many years ago, I guess 5 years ago for me is many years ago, but 5 years ago, that the first high-value detainee captured after 9/11, his name is Abu Zubaydah. He has a brother who lives in the United States, who lives in Florida. And so I was trying to think about a profile I wanted to write about this high-value detainee who was first held at a CIA black site, then it was held at Guantanamo. I couldn't believe he had a brother here. I reached out to his brother, flew out to Florida to meet with him, hoping that he would provide me with some insight into this brother, Abu Zubaydah, who was in Guantanamo, because we really didn't know too much about him. We only knew what the government was telling us. And then I found out, and after speaking with him, that the guy in Florida had just had his own fascinating story to tell. So I convinced him to sign over a privacy waiver to me. And I filed a FOIA request with the FBI. About 3 months after I filed that FOIA request, I get a phone call from this guy's wife. She says, "Jason, the FBI is here. There's a special agent here, and they're asking about you. And I said, what? What are they asking about? They're asking about your FOIA. And I'm like, what? That's crazy. So I filed a FOIA on myself for everything that was said about me by the FBI at this particular place on that day. 6 months later, the FBI turned over 3 pages, and sure enough, they sent out a special agent to investigate, my FOIA request, and which I've never heard of before. And they interrogated this guy about what he told me and whether I forged his name on the privacy waiver. So it was, I went to battle with the FBI over that, and eventually they turned over all the documents. But that was fun. That was my first sort of meta FOIA experience. I do a lot of meta FOIAs, so I knew things would be a lot of fun after filing that one.
Okay, David?
So I'll mention my first FOIA experience and one of the more interesting. So the first one was, we were talking about 1966 and the passage of FOIA. So a year later, in 1967, this was a journalistic crowd will appreciate this, and some of you might remember this, that the first big expose of CIA wrongdoing or CIA controversy was Ramparts magazine disclosed the fact that the CIA had been secretly funding the National Student Association since its creation in the early 50s. It was a big scandal. President Johnson created a special commission to investigate this, and anyway, this was sort of the first big controversy involving the CIA. So fast forward to the early 80s, I had just gotten out of law school and come to Washington, and I knew people who were at the successor organization of the National Student Association, which was called the United States Student Association. Mm-hmm. And they had made a FOIA request sort of trying to learn the organization's secret history. So they made a request to the FBI and the CIA and basically got stonewalled. So they approached me and asked me if I could file a FOIA lawsuit for them. And I had never done it, but I got some guidance by some attorneys at Public Citizen Litigation Group. And I filed the case, and we ended up getting a fair amount of information. The recent footnote to this is that all these many years later, a lot of the material that we got through that lawsuit has contributed to a book that was just recently published last year, detailing, sort of going through this history of the CIA's relationship with the Student Association by a writer named Karen Padgett. The book is called Patriotic Betrayal, and it relies on a lot of this material. So it's sort of a reminder that this process takes a long time, and it wasn't so much that the government took a long time, but the writing of the history took a long time. So you've got to be very persistent with these things. So probably the most interesting, or one of the most interesting, was a few years ago I was contacted by a writer in California named William Volman, who I was not familiar with. But apparently he's a well-regarded writer. His stuff is a little strange, but he's won the National Book Award, and he's a solid guy, but a little bit on the edge, let's say. So he told me that he had made requests with the CIA and the FBI for his own files, and he was sure that they must have things. He couldn't really articulate any reason, but he was just sure of this. And this is something that I hear many times from many people. When you're a lawyer who specializes in FOIA, you get contacted by lots of people who are sure that the FBI has massive files on them. So I said, well, okay, if you're able to, if your publisher is able to devote some fees to this and you really want to pursue it, we can pursue it. So we did, and to make a long story short, he ended up discovering the fact that he had been a Unabomber suspect and had a massive FBI file, and he ended up writing a very interesting article for Harper's about this experience and discovering that he had been, under suspicion and under surveillance for several years. So that was sort of an experience that taught me to not be so skeptical when people come to me and say they think there's something to be gotten.
Great. So for my part, I was involved with the Withers litigation, where the Memphis Commercial Appeal sued for access to Ernest Withers' FBI file. Ernest Withers was a civil rights era photographer who was very close to the civil rights movement, and he was also an FBI informant. And the FBI fought us tooth and nail until one day the Judge Amy Berman Jackson called us into open court and asked the FBI on the record whether they were really prepared to litigate whether the surveillance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was for a law enforcement purpose. And because she didn't think that they actually were prepared to do that, and the law does in fact require it. And after that, the parties were able to craft a pretty workable settlement with sort of utilizing the National Archives and Records Administration to help release the documents, which was ultimately what our client wanted. So now that you know where we're coming from, our panel this evening will cover the good, the bad, and the ugly of the administration's FOIA record. We'll get into the specific successes, the routine failures, and some of the more troublesome practices that we've seen. So to get us started, each panelist is going to let us know what their opinion of the Obama administration's record is in brief. David, you want to start?
Yeah, so I should start by saying, so as my story about filing, my first FOIA case in the early 80s indicates, I've litigated cases against, in the course of many administrations going back to Reagan. So I sort of come at this very skeptically. I've heard a lot of administrations make promises and have come to the conclusion that what we're really talking about sort of is bureaucratic culture, and there's not that much that a president or an attorney general can really do to change sort of the knee-jerk resistance that occurs in most agencies to the concept of having somebody on the outside look over their shoulders. So that's sort of my general approach to any claims of reform. But having said that, I along with the rest of the FOIA community, was very encouraged when, in his first full day in office, the president made a point of going on record very strongly and affirmatively with respect to FOIA. And that was then followed up on March 19th of 2009, when Attorney General Holder issued his memo, which was in part rescinding Attorney General Ashcroft's prior memo on FOIA compliance within the Justice Department and the Justice Department's defense of agencies in litigation. So I thought everything that was said was great. Unfortunately, I soon realized through the course of litigation that the promises might not really be met because the Attorney General's memo specifically went to the issue of the circumstances under which the Justice Department would defend FOIA cases. EFF had several pending FOIA cases that had started during the Bush administration, where the agencies had resisted disclosure and the Justice Department defended them, and these cases were still pending. So it seemed to us that if the Attorney General was announcing a change in the standard under which the Justice Department would defend cases, that probably they were going to want to take a look at the all pending cases. So we specifically requested from the court that our cases be stayed to allow the Justice Department to assess the impact of the new Holder standards. And in all of those cases, the Justice Department opposed the stay, basically taking the position that the Attorney General's memo had no impact, and there wasn't any reason to slow down the proceedings in the case because the government's position wasn't going to change. So that was sort of my first very clear indication that what was written on paper wasn't necessarily going to have a real meaningful impact in actual cases. And I think that's pretty much been borne out. I haven't had any cases that I have filed, regardless of how ridiculous the agency's position was that was being challenged, where I was contacted by a Justice Department lawyer who said, look, we've looked at this case, we think you're right, and we'd like to talk about settling. It's never happened. So from a litigation perspective, that I thought was going to be the most clear-cut way in which the Obama policy was going to be implemented, and it's never happened. So, I'll leave it at that. In terms of different agencies and, response times and positions, I think it's kind of across the board. But sort of as a high-level policy matter, I think the defense of litigation really speaks volumes about, whether or not that promise has been kept.
Mike?
I'm of two minds about this. I'd like to return briefly to a point David made about bureaucratic culture. I don't think you can underestimate the power of the bureaucracy here, and it transcends any administration, and it's going to inevitably infect even the most stalwart reformer. I'd go back to what happened when Lyndon Johnson was contemplating signing the act. He said, "What is Moss trying to do? Screw me?" he said. "I thought he's one of our boys, but the Justice Department tells me his goddamn bill will screw the Johnson administration." Johnson, a Democrat, felt betrayed by John Moss, a Democrat. Why? Well, he was Lyndon Johnson, that's the way he operated, but also because executive branches will always hold with the utmost vigor to information in their possession. I think that's regardless of the presidency. And so to some extent, I take it as inevitable. The numbers do show or do suggest that this administration has not been very forthcoming. Here are a couple of numbers. In 2008, 6% of all FOIA requests that were processed were denied based on exemption, 6%. In 2014, 9%. The rate of denial is more striking in the law enforcement and security apparatus. I looked at the annual reports compiled by the Office of Information Policy. Between 2006 and 2008, 30% of CIA requests were fully denied. Between 2012 and 2014, that increased to 54%. The rate is similar, it doubled at the FBI from about 8 to about 16%. So just the raw numbers tell us that for whatever reason, and there may be several, at least in the security apparatus, the security agencies, the Obama administration is much more stringent on information it's releasing than was the Bush administration. Maybe that's because they're undermanned and they're overwhelmed by a massive increase in the number of requests and it's easier for them to reject it. Maybe it's because they're just tight-ass. I don't know, but it's undeniable to observe that they're denying more requests than they used to. On the other hand, I will say this. I have not litigated these cases. I've never filed a FOIA suit. So I'm more maybe happy-go-lucky about this. But I would say the very fact that I can pull these numbers out of idle curiosity from the agencies themselves, because they're required under FOIA to file electronically available reports summarizing, actually detailing all the requests, all the denials, how they're processed, is itself a success for FOIA. The agencies make public the information that we use to kick them around. So So there's a lot to be said for what FOIA is accomplishing right now, even though I'd agree, there's a troubling increase in full denials.
Oh, where to begin? Where to start? So, I think this is a really, really big deal. It's really important to emphasize that in 2009, when President Obama signed this extraordinary memorandum, this presidential memorandum, promising to usher in a new era in transparency and open government, we had just finished 8 years of a very, very secretive administration post 9/11. At least on the national security side, it was very difficult to learn about a wide range of programs, things that were being done in our name, whether it was the CIA's black site program, drones, Guantanamo. So this was very refreshing that you had a president that was promising transparency. And this is something that everyone forgets. It was only 3 months, however, 3 months after that memorandum was signed, that at least I became aware that it was completely just a facade. Because 3 months after that memorandum was signed, there was a decision in a very important case that the ACLU had before, I believe it was the Second Circuit, about the release of photographs showing the treatment of detainees in custody of the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was a very important decision, and the court held that, and the appeals court, that look, you got to release these photographs. And President Obama indicated that he was going to release them, that these photographs would be released. Now, just a few weeks before these photographs were released, he agreed not to fight, again, in the ACLU's case, the release of the infamous torture memos. Okay, so that was released, but that came with a backlash, a severe backlash by Republicans, Dick Cheney, and his daughter, Lynn. And this was a moment where the administration, I believe, said to itself that they would never allow this to happen again. And what happened is they fought, after agreeing that they would allow these photographs to be released and not fight, the appeals court, they worked with Congress to change FOIA. I mean, this is just a couple of months, 3 months afterwards. And first they went to the Supreme Court. So they fought this at the Supreme Court. And then they worked with Congress to change FOIA and to change it in such a way that requesters would not be allowed to gain access to photographs or any kind of media that would reveal the treatment of detainees in custody of the U.S. military, based on the fact that it's a national security threat. And there was an exemption kind of built into a new exemption kind of built into this. So that completely undercut the promises of transparency, and that's actually forgotten. I mean, people just forget that happened a short time after he came into office. And for me, as a reporter who covers national security, I depend heavily on these documents. As a reporter who does not like to use anonymous sources and tries to get people on the record, documents are really kind of the most important tool that I have. And so there's been a fight every step of the way. I have 24 FOIA lawsuits against the government. And I'm fortunate that I work for a news organization that completely supports and backs me on that. But it is amazing to see how this goes across the board in terms of it's not just the CIA, the Department of Defense, or the FBI, which by the way is the worst in response to FOIA, but it's Treasury, it's State Department. Forget it; they won't even respond to you. And that's certainly been my experience. So I think it's more than just bureaucracy. I actually think it's just, it's been worse. It's progressively, getting worse and has gotten worse. And perhaps that's due to the fact that there aren't enough resources. But, I will just, close with this, is that last week, through a FOIA request, that the Freedom of the Press Foundation filed, a FOIA lawsuit that they filed against the Justice Department, and the documents that they shared with me, we were able to see the opposition that the administration had in 2014 to the FOIA reform bill. And this was essentially just, a bill. This was the House bill that it referred to, but this 6-page memo was amazing because it opposed any and every effort to reform the Freedom of Information Act. and codifying that presidential memorandum into law. It was sort of funny that we had to get it through a FOIA request, which, by the way, one of the things that this FOIA reform bill would do is change this B5, exemption that is abused, and all the documents were B5'd, I think it's okay to say it's really bad. There are some little tiny eensy weensy little things that they do that are, that's great, that are some changes, but what's really bad far outweighs, what's good. And that's my experience as somebody who files requests. They may call me a vexatious requester, which they have, and also a terrorist. And I actually found that in documents. That's why, anyway. But
Badge of honor?
Yes, badge of honor. We should have those buttons next time. But I think it's okay to sort of say, like, this is really bad. And and by the way, it's unfortunate that James isn't here, because in those documents that were released last week that I wrote this story about, the opposition, administration's opposition to FOIA, there was this amazing sort of disclosure about this turf war between the Justice Department's Office of Information Policy and the Office of Government Information Services, and how basically they're like, you can't give them any more power, and this is an office that would actually be of benefit to requesters to seek some help through. And that has been a long sort of ongoing, battle there. So, here we are 7 years later, and sorry, but I just don't see, those improvements or that transparency that we were promised. And if it wasn't for the fact, sort of, go on about this, that the administration constantly says it. It's not as if they said it in 2009 and stopped. We are the most transparent in history. They say it over and over and over again. And it's the facts and the statistics just show that it's just a complete lie.
Well, I don't know. We don't have the government here to defend themselves, so
I'll call them. Anyone got a phone number for the government? We're in DC.
Let me ask this if I can. So there are 715,000 FOIA requests last year in 2014. Surely you're not saying that all of those requests and all of the agencies responding to the requests are bad. Isn't it just a slight percentage that deal with the specific areas of national security where there's a problem?
I don't have the actual numbers, but I will say this. Sure, yeah, the backlog has grown extraordinarily, and it's not just a national security I'm talking about. I filed a request with the FCC on net neutrality, just to find out what was taking place behind the scenes. They gave me 2,000 pages of records that were completely redacted under B5. That's an abuse of an exemption. So sure, they get credit for making a production, right, that is completely redacted and renders this information useless. So, these are the things that they are supposed to, these agencies were supposed to change. Act with a presumption of openness, and they just have not. So they get credit by putting in their reports, hey, look, we gave out records. But sorry, what do those records look like? That's been my experience, and I've got over 1,000 outstanding FOIA requests.
It's hard for any one person to have really a global view of what's going on government-wide. We all sort of have our beats. So for EFF, mostly I also deal with security and law enforcement agencies, which obviously by reputation are the worst. But I also wear another hat, which is that in addition to my work for EFF, I also represent other clients. And one of them, for instance, is an auto safety research group who makes a lot of requests to NHTSA for auto safety and recall type information. And that was very eye-opening for me, because I had always heard that, once you get out of national security and law enforcement, you tend to have much fewer problems. NHTSA is terrible. I've in almost every instance in which my client has had an obstacle there, we have had to go to court. The Justice Department has defended them. They've been very obstinate, and it's really not that much different than dealing with the FBI or the CIA.
And I'd say I can't play devil's advocate forever. I've had problems with the most.
forever.
The most benign of domestic agencies, the National Park Service, the Department of Agriculture, for other reasons that we may talk about, reverse FOIA and corporate issues. So I've had problems as well. But when the fact is that 65% of Interior Department requests are fully complied with, full release, that suggests that lots of people are getting what they ask for. So I wouldn't paint with an overly broad brush how disastrously bad the administration is.
Do you think, Mike, that is a result of how the FOIA requests are framed? Are people requesting, are requests overly broad, making it difficult for the agency to release fully everything that's requested, and maybe the more narrow requests are in fact being granted?
I don't know. I think that's a great question. In my experience, and other requesters may have had similar experiences, a lot seems to depend on the personality of the FOIA officer, some of whom are really great and they're helpful. It's like they see their constituency is the public on whose behalf the requester is seeking information. And they're great to work with, and so perhaps some agencies are just blessed with a solid bureaucrat. Sometimes they seem to be existing to deter you at every step of the way. So I wouldn't abide by the notion that it's all personality or character, but in my experience, some of it has to do with the nature of the officer.
I've never had, just on the officer, experience. I mean, I'm very, delightful to them. I really am, and I have the emails to show it. Hi, how are you? How was your day? Did you have a good weekend? How are the kids? I mean, I do say that regularly. And I recognize that the officer is getting, whoever is processing my request, they're getting a pile of requests, and they need to get through it. It's not, they're not saying, well, should we give this, to Jason or not? They're not saying it. They're just trying to get through it. There's another level. I mean, I actually filed a FOIA to find out something that I learned about, which is significant FOIA requests within the Department of Defense. Okay, and within the Department of Defense, if there are what they call significant FOIA requests, those are FOIA requests and documents that are produced that would generate media attention or negative attention, they go up the flagpole, to the top official. I don't know if it's being approved, but it's kind of being politicized. It's sort of clogging. It's clogging the pipeline, so to speak. So I've learned a lot over the past 6-7 years about how this is all working out, and that has been an eye-opening experience. My experience with the officers is that they kind of just want to get through it. I had this enormous request with Health and Human Services on Ebola, getting some information on that, and the officer that I dealt with there, or the analyst, he was amazing, and he just felt so badly that he couldn't get these documents to me on an expedited basis, because there was this Ebola outbreak, and he's like, yeah, well, we can't get it to you, but when he did, they just B5'd everything. They just applied these exemptions. So something's happening, in between all of that. And by the way, those numbers, it's too bad Nate Jones isn't here, who really has this great insight and can speak authoritatively about how the Justice Department, Office of Information Policy, cooks its numbers. Anyway. I'm just negative tonight, aren't I? I'm sorry. So negative.
So I'll sort of, recognize, some interest on the government side. I mean, it is true, that the incentives are sort of perverse, which is to say that an agency that does a good job to quickly respond to requests is going to probably get more requests, because if they have a reputation as being a place where you can actually get something, more people will make requests. Whereas on the other hand, if you're the State Department and requesters know, well, it's going to be, 10 months before you even start, hearing from them, then they're less likely to make a request. So, you know, you do have to sort of take that into account, that the incentives are a little bit screwed up.
Well, and in private litigation, we're seeing the expenses and time associated with electronic discovery sort of skyrocketing just because there's so much more data and so many more emails and all of that, and technology to a certain extent. Do you think that that plays a role in certainly the backlog and the delays, if not the ultimate production of information?
You're asking whether technology contributes to the delay?
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive. You would assume that that wasn't the case, but you know, I'm always amazed at how bad the indexing systems are and the ability of an agency to search for something, to do keyword searches. I mean, even, you know, many agencies, when you're asking for email on particular subject matter or from particular, you know, senders or recipients, I've been told by agencies, well, we can't do that kind of search in our email system. It's like, really? I can do it on my laptop. I mean, why can't you do that? And, you know, so I don't understand what the technology problem is in a lot of these agencies, but they apparently
It's funny,
exist.
when you sue the agencies after they say that they can't do the email search, suddenly they can. It's really weird how that works out.
I have not always found that to be the case.
Really?
I've seen them go to a judge and
Yeah.
file a declaration and say, we just can't do it. It's not designed that way.
Yeah, I think in my experience, there is a thought that the all-knowing, all-seeing government, while a bunch of incompetent nincompoops, is also utter omnipotent. And you file a request, and with the Justice Department, it's easily gotten. And I'm coming to a murder trial that never ends, actually. And there's going to be a retrial, and to watch the attempts by the defense attorneys through the discovery process to get the Bureau of Prisons records from the assistant U.S. attorneys. It's not my FOIA request, but it actually wasn't even a FOIA request by the defense. But it's been one litany of one disaster after another. You'd think the Justice Department would just push the button, put it in the name of the suspect, and all the files would come spitting out. And it's to the contrary. It's little fiefdoms and incompatible systems. I mean, it's not quite to your question, but it's eye-opening to see there is a technology flaw there.
I just want to add though to the, about the electronic records or that you were
The amount of
referring
data.
the amount of data. So what's interesting is that one of the good things about some of the changes that were made under this administration is sort of the access to electronic forms. FOIA online, I think is okay. But the problem also is that these agencies are not making proactive disclosures. And proactive disclosures, and putting it on their FOIA reading rooms. So you would not necessarily have to, file a request for something that you think that should be released publicly. I mean, so every agency has a FOIA reading room. And I happen to check it on a regular basis, and it's amazing, how many of them are just not even, up to date. Some of them from 2007, for example. It's the last thing that was put up there. So, perhaps that could cut, the backlog a bit. And I don't think they're taking advantage of these, this electronic infrastructure that they have. To do that, where you could just point and say, oh, by the way, these records are located here if you're filing for something.
On the electronic reading room, I'll note the Senate's unanimous passage of the FOIA Improvement Act. Well, two things. First of all, we were having a pre-discussion, the panelists, the other day, and Christine, I guess, asked, so what do you think? Is the FOIA Act going to pass? And I said, no way, never going to happen. So it's passed the Senate, and I'm not sure, and it's passed the House, I guess, in a different form. But one of the provisions is, I think it says, if a FOIA Act has been, if a FOIA request on the same topic has been made 3 times, then the response is proactively to be published in the electronic reading room, which goes some direction towards.
Yeah, I mean, the FBI does that sometimes. For example, Sandy Berger, who passed away, filed a request for his records. They sent a letter out saying, we've received many requests on this. It will be posted in the vault. They didn't say when, though. That's kind of a problem.
Did they post it?
They did not. That was maybe 7 months ago.
And
So
probably in this room, everyone knows it, but if you haven't, when you have filled with idle curiosity, check out the FBI's The Vault. It's extremely entertaining. They've got hundreds of released files: Al Capone, the Beatles, Charlie Chaplin. I mean, you could while away many hours looking at that stuff.
Yeah, Steinbrenner's was there.
Yes.
But oddly, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who's deceased, they only have 6 pages on him. Really weird. Kind of think there's more. Anyway.
I think they're glomerizing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've focused a lot on the criticisms, but I do want to make sure that we are trying to talk somewhat about the administration's successes, some of which have already come up, but because Director Holzer isn't here tonight, I thought I'd try to help him along talking about OGIS and its role and sort of the challenges that it's facing, but what they are trying to do. So I think as you may know, OGIS is the Office of Government Information Services, and they were created to serve as a bridge between FOIA requesters and the agencies. And they have a mediation program. They review the agency's compliance and policies, and that's part of how what Mike was referring to when these reports are coming out about agencies' FOIA records. A lot of that is running through OGIS, or at least touching on OGIS in part. So I think that if Director Holzer was here tonight, he would say that OGIS has made tremendous progress and that its mediation program handled 32% more cases this year than they handled last year. It closed mediation cases in 42 days. And I think they'd say they're trying, right? They're hamstrung because the mediation program, as you mentioned, there's turf battles. They are marginalized within the administration, but they're doing the best they can with the tools that they've been given. They don't have any authority over agencies to get them to do anything. All they have is nagging, I think. And so, but one of the case studies that they highlight in this report, this is their 2006, the cover of their 2016 report, they highlighted working with the Naval Research Laboratory, who was producing pictures in response to an NPR request, and they were producing pictures that were not of print quality. And they went back and forth with NPR a couple of times before, NPR went back and forth with the agency a couple of times over the quality of the photos, and then they said, no, we can't, we're closing this request, we've produced it twice already, we're not doing it anymore. And the NPR, instead of filing an administrative appeal, went through OGIS and was able to get the NPR photo people with the photo editors, with the, I think, people within the Naval Research Laboratory so that they could get the quality of the photos up. So I thought that was an example that they're touting of something that where they might be able to help allow help agencies think outside the box a little bit in terms of, and make them a little bit less reluctant to work with requesters. Then have any of you had experience with the OGIS mediation? And
I have some time back, and I think it is incredibly important, and I'm glad that OGIS exists. And, last week I was at the Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference, the NICAR conference, and again, given a talk speaking about FOIA, and there was a big room of journalists, a lot of reporters who file FOIA requests, and in speaking with them, they did not know about OGIS. They did not know that because they all complained that they could not afford a lawsuit, and I understand that that's expensive, resources. And that newsrooms may not want to invest in, but they did not even know that this was, something that they could utilize the Office of Government Information Services, that they could go through this, even though the letters that they get at the end say, in short of, filing a lawsuit, you can go there. So, my experience in the past was, I'm not sure, I think it was 2008 with DHS. It was incredibly positive. But for national security issues, when I'm dealing with the CIA, it's mostly like I can't imagine that the CIA is going to be like, oh yeah, good argument. All right, we'll give you those things.
So how did that work? How did OGIS work in your case?
I mean, it was basically kind of mediating with Department of Homeland Security to get these records that were, that I was seeking, and it was successful. I mean, it was a very, very narrow request. I think it was for a report that was FOIA, this fake classification.
I think
So,
I mean I have not
yeah.
I have not taken any matters to OGIS, but I think, for instance, the kind of example you give with photo quality or something like that it probably can be very helpful. But the kinds of things that tend to get litigated, I would be very skeptical of the ability of OGIS or any mediator to resolve. Given how obstinate the agencies tend to be with their positions in those cases. So, as another data point, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for a couple of years had a pilot program in which they were requiring that all FOIA cases that went on appeal to the court had to be submitted for court-supervised mediation. And I had a couple of appeals that were subject to that requirement, and we did it. And it was obvious from the first 10 minutes of the process that it was going to be a waste of time. I mean, the Justice Department just was not really willing to give an inch in any of those cases. So I just think it's not really a comment on OGIS, but it's really the limitations of mediation when you're really dealing with some very fundamental agency positions that they're just not going to give in. And you see that as well with if a requester wins in the district court, the government will almost always appeal. And as the ACLU detainee photos case indicates, if they lose in the Court of Appeals, they'll go to the Supreme Court. I mean, that's just the attitude that they're going to fight tooth and nail as much as they can. So in that environment, mediation is of limited utility.
Yeah.
Well, just a question on that. Do you think because that's what litigators do, is they fight to the last drop, or is it because they're taking the lead from the top of the administration that we are not really an open administration, we will fight open efforts? In other words, is it just bureaucracies hold on information and lawyers litigate?
I don't know. I mean, so again, I go back to the Holder memo that was supposed to change the Justice Department's position in defending agencies. I mean, whenever you're involved in a lawsuit, or I don't know at OGIS if Justice Department lawyers ever get involved on behalf of an agency, but certainly in the court-supervised mediation, it was Justice Department lawyers, and clearly the Holder directive to sort of be very strict in deciding when the department will or won't defend an agency position didn't have any effect in the mediation process, just like it doesn't have any effect in the litigation process. So it seems that all of the situations I'm involved in, there's a Justice Department representative, and that's the filter, and the filter isn't really helping to resolve anything. To the contrary.
But I think it's probably a mix, depending on which agency you're dealing with, because the agency really is the client. And
Yep.
so if the agency wants to fight tooth and nail, they're going to fight tooth and nail. And then, of course, lawyers fight all the time. It's what we like to do.
But if the Justice Department was sending a message throughout the government that they were being more stringent and were not going to defend every agency denial, that would start having an impact on agency behavior. And that's why I thought it was a great thing when Holder signed that memo, that really could have an impact. But they just haven't followed up with it.
Okay. Well, I think it's getting late, and so we should probably start turning to sort of our last topic, or one of our last topics, which is what I identified as the ugly. So this year we've had the administration sort of have two pretty high-level issues where they weren't just sort of your routine failures, your bureaucratic issues, but you actually had the administration actively working against transparency. We had Secretary Clinton's personal email account, and we had the FOIA reform efforts that Jason wrote about last week. So, Jason, you sued for access to Secretary Clinton's emails. How big of an issue is this for you in terms of her use of the personal email address?
Oh, it was. When I filed this, just by way of background, in November of 2014 or late October 2014, when it became very clear that Secretary Clinton was going to mount a campaign for president as a Democrat, I do what I normally do and file a FOIA request so we can gain some access to some records and see how she performed as Secretary of State and share that information with the public. And in this case, I just happened to, for some odd reason, file a request and said I would like all of her emails. I don't normally do that, but for some reason I did on this one. And this was well before there was any revelation or that I was even aware that there was a use of a private email account, an exclusive use, and litigated, filed a lawsuit in January, and then 2 months later, the New York Times came out with its story, and then shortly thereafter, the Associated Press revealed that it was a private email server. And again, I want to make the point that these records, these emails, I felt would have been very, very important in terms of just providing the public with information about her tenure as Secretary of State. But I think it's a huge issue. I mean, this is, to me, my immediate impression was this was a clear-cut attempt to thwart the Freedom of Information Act and the Federal Records Act. That was my kind of knee-jerk reaction without any evidence. I didn't have any evidence to back that up. But it became very clear to me, at least, that's what was going on. Because everyone else, for the most part, within the State Department, had been, using this a government account. The claims that Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and Madeleine Albright, the Clinton's predecessors, also behave this way is absolutely untrue. Okay, this was unique to Hillary Clinton.
But remember,
they did not have a private email server, and they did not exclusively use a private email account to conduct official business.
But remember when Bush officials used Republican National Committee addresses?
Yes.
Similar.
It's definitely similar, and yes, and I believe that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And for me, and this universe suddenly became very big in terms of, I started looking at some of my other FOIA requests, and I had FOIA requests out for some emails from Chuck Hagel, former Secretary of Defense. And I had asked for certain emails in which there was, the phrase war crimes was mentioned. I got a tip on something. The Department of Defense responded by saying he doesn't use an email account here, so we don't have any records. But after this, these revelations with Secretary Clinton, I got another response from the press secretary to the Secretary of Defense saying, hey, we just want to talk to you. So actually, it turns out that Chuck Hagel doesn't have a government email account, but he was doing his business on Gmail. And so we're going to go get those records for you. We want you to know, don't be upset with us, but we're going to get those records and we're going to process that for you. And I'm like, well, thank you. And when did you plan on telling me this? Then I filed this separate request with the Justice Department related to allegations about CIA and Senate spying. They turned over some records actually just a few weeks ago. And this was amazing because these records, makes me so angry. I waited a year for, again, B5, B5, B5. But the production letter had this very fascinating revelation. All emails that are in this production that mention or that say Lou Alcindor at usdoj.gov is actually Eric Holder. And Lou Alcindor is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's birth name. So Eric Holder was using Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's birth name as his official government email account. And I was kind of weirded out by this, but then I searched and spoke to some folks at NARA, and they don't recommend using alias emails. So my point in this long diatribe in response to your question is that this is a really big deal. I believe that these efforts to conduct government business through these other channels is so these records would not be retained, and to thwart efforts by requesters like us, to gain access to that material. And in the case of Secretary Clinton, it is a huge fucking deal. So I really believe that. Excuse my whispering there.
Well, I mean, I think it's more widespread than is generally known, and the silver lining of this is that because it's Hillary Clinton and she's as high profile as she is, it has sort of finally directed public attention to a fairly widespread problem.
The thing is that, yes, I think it has. And then what happens, however, or what has happened, is that it's become so partisan. My attempts to gain access to her emails was by no means, a partisan effort. I'm a reporter trying to provide the public with information, trying to provide my readers, with information about, a candidate who's running, for the highest office in the land. But it's all become very partisan, whether it's with Lois Lerner and over at the EPA, and certainly it's been turned into that. But I think these efforts to sort of thwart our attempts to gain access to this is widespread. And at the Office of Legal Counsel, I think this is another important point as well. Providing legal advice through email, which somehow would count as an opinion. I mean, I know that Politico, I think Josh Gerstein over at Politico reported this, where it would just be difficult since we can't gain access to the legal memos, or by doing it another way through email would certainly thwart our efforts.
The thing that bothers me about this is it's virtually impossible to police sort of how all of this is done. So the criticism of Hillary is that, well, you should have had two accounts, right? You should have had your government account, the state.gov account for official business, and then you could have done whatever you wanted on your server for your personal stuff. The problem is, that's sort of the scenario that almost everyone who works in the government has. They have their work account and they have their personal. So, how do you police,
well, I think that
attempts to thwart FOIA by first, sort of using the Gmail account to your colleague's Gmail account. So that's kind of not findable in a FOIA request. Or even worse, the reality is that one employee says to the other employee, let's go out to lunch. I want to talk to you about something.
Right.
So, it's a difficult problem to police.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
However, in the case of Hillary Clinton, there were many requests that were filed 4 or 5 years ago. And one of the unanswered questions is, when requests were filed for emails 4 or 5 years ago, what happened? Did they go and say, we need to gain access to these emails? How do we do it? Who said what to whom?
But my question is, so going forward,
right.
How do we ensure that there are not off the books communications?
Yeah, I think there needs to be severe punishment. That's one of the problems. It's a whole other issue with FOIA, is that you can get away with there's no real penalty, even though there are some things built in. Nobody's ever
Fees.
held accountable.
Well, in fact, I'm thinking the perverse incentive out of the exposure that Hillary Clinton is getting is that it will drive people into a different underground instead of a private email server. They're going across the street to Lafayette Park and using burner phones or something. There's the urge for secrecy will just find new ways to express itself.
Well,
Right,
I
I
think
don't
the
think if the
secrecy has
less-
always been there.
I mean, if the lesson that comes out of this from the bureaucrat or the official's perspective is if you do it on email, it's going to be FOIA'd and it's going to turn
Right.
into a scandal. If then the incentive is going to be let's communicate in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like in Goodfellas talking about the gangsters. You don't put it in writing, you don't say it, you just with a nod, just the silent communication, and it's understood. That's the safest.
Cue Eric Clapton's Layla piano exit.
Okay. Well, what about FOIA reform? Where are we now that the Senate's passed a bill? It's not the same as the House bill, so they would have to go to conference. I think Congressman Isa threatened the president to veto it. But what do you think is going to happen? Predictions?
Well, first of all, it doesn't really go that far. I mean, a lot of the problems we've talked about tonight are not addressed by the bill. I mean, in terms of delay, I have observed for years that the problem is one of resources, that there isn't enough money provided to agencies or forced at agencies to do proper FOIA implementation. In fact, there is language in the Senate bill that passed unanimously yesterday that says, nothing in this legislation authorizes the expenditure of any money. So as far as it goes, it's okay, but it's not really a game changer in terms of most of the problems we've been talking about.
Yeah, I agree with regards to the lack of resources. 12% drop in the number of FOIA officers in the last 3 years. Would be meaningful reform. I haven't followed the legislation really closely, so that's the reason I'm making all sorts of wrong predictions. Monday I predicted it would go nowhere. Now I'm predicting that the fact that it passed unanimously is proof that it's utterly anodyne
But the president might still veto it. I mean, this is what we learned, from the last go around.
Well, I mean, yesterday the Josh Earnest said that he will sign it, and he even noted that he'd like Congress to be subject to FOIA. I'm going to be,
luck with
but not
that.
the White House, only Congress. This is where the positive part of me comes out, and I think it's great and important that it passed. And I'm troubled by the House bill, which has intelligence carve-outs, exempting certain information, which the Senate bill does not have. There is important B5 changes that are there. The FOIA online portal. These are things that if they are in fact implemented, particularly B5, which would be very important for historians and journalists gaining access to certain information, I think it is a very important and positive development. And it should be noted that this is one of the only pieces of legislation over the past 7 years that has total bipartisan support. So I think that's a positive development. I really hope that to see that the House will eventually, when they get both of their bills together, that there will be a vote on it, unlike what happened in 2014. But one last thing is that I think that there's also been I've been noticing and just the awareness about public records laws, open records, FOIA, has been quite amazing. That the public, it's not just journalists, not just corporations, but the public really utilizing this tool. It's still, to me, as negatively as I spoke about it, a hugely important tool. I mean, last year I broke a number of very important stories, in my humble opinion, based on FOIA documents. One of them being this amazing story about how the CIA, really did spy on the Senate, And the fact that the CIA accidentally turned over an apology letter from John Brennan to the Senate that they gave to me, which they then asked me not to post, which then I said, ha 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 ha. So it of course it took litigation to get that, but to get all those documents. But despite that, it's still very important and a very important tool. And I think that one of the things we didn't hit on, but we touched on it briefly, is that sometimes actually having a really good request will cut down on the response time. I have templates. My requests are not necessarily so narrow. I mean, I do make broad requests, but the templates do serve as an instructional guide, to the agencies, and working with them in terms of narrowing. I mean, there are ways in which you still can gain access to records, even if there is a stonewalling that's taking place.
I'd like to close at least this portion with a shout out to a person who to me is the exemplar of why FOIA is one of the greatest pieces of legislation for all its shortcomings, and that is a murdering human scum named Fernando Bustillo. This is just something that was resolved in the D.C. court yesterday. Bustillo is serving life in prison without parole at Terre Haute, U.S. Penitentiary, Terre Haute in Indiana. He killed another inmate in a rage. He's a vexatious litigant. He's suing all the time. He sounds like a real jerk, not to mention dangerous as can be. He used the Freedom of Information Act because he says when he was processed into Terre Haute prison or penitentiary, he was mistreated. He was abused by a correctional officer, and he wanted to find out who this guy was so he could file some action against him. And so Bustillo, this human insect, this scum of the earth, used this great law to try to identify the person who he says abused him. And it turns out he filed a FOIA action. It was denied. He filed a lawsuit. He lost the lawsuit. So it's not a happy ending for him, but I think how great is it that a man serving life in prison without parole for a savage murder has the same access to possibly justice. Maybe he was abused by this correctional officer. Maybe he could have in another universe succeeded with his FOIA request and gotten some justice, even though he will die in prison. So to me, Fernando Bustillo is the type of person, not just us here at the table, but out there in the world that use this great law.
Yeah, I mean, as a judicially enforceable citizen's right, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, usually if a citizen tries to sue the federal government, you don't have standing and you don't have an injury, and I mean, you have to go through all these hoops. But FOIA, I made a request and they denied it, and here I am. And the government has to answer to you. And, a federal judge reviews, the two arguments, and that's very powerful.
Yeah, and you can ask for anything you want. They don't have to give it to you, but you can ask for it.
For any reason
For anything.
whatsoever.
And anyone in the world can. So it's not just obviously for U.S. citizens.
Yeah, and your reason doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So we'll skip election predictions and close on that note, since it is such a positive note. Let's open it up for questions. Here you go.
I'm glad I got to ask a question. My name's Andre Goodfriend. I'm with the State Department, a Foreign Service officer who's back here now trying to put together our open government plan for 2016. And I'm a Foreign Service officer, so it's important for me that that FOIA work, because representing U.S. values abroad, and what my last post was as the Charge d'Affaires DCM in Budapest, being able to say that people need to have access to information and that the citizens need to be engaged with their government, and to use my own country as an example is important. So coming back here now and saying, how can we overcome the difficulties, and you mentioned some of them, the difficulties of information flow within a bureaucracy, the difficulties of being understaffed. How do we overcome that is what we're trying to accomplish. We have a new transparency coordinator working on, at a senior level position, working on OIG recommendations, trying to put together an accountability plan with regards to being responsive to FOIA, dealing with an 80% increase last year in the amount of litigation with regards to FOIA requests. And so that pushes all of the other requests, it puts additional delays in other requests. So leaving all that aside, my question really is, in all seriousness, what are some things that we can actually do as we put together our 2016 Open Government Plan, in which we have to lay out the things that we are going to do to improve our commitment to FOIA? And we rely upon our saying we are the most open that we can be, because that gives us strength inside in our own agencies to say we have to do this. It's a presidential priority. We should repeat it. We should repeat it often because we have to do it. What are some of the things that we can put into our plan that will help address these issues?
Well, I mean, I'll go back to the point I made about resources. I mean, to the extent that the State Department is in fact understaffed on their FOIA operation, and this is something we hear all the time, I think the agency needs to look internally at how it spends money that is devoted to information dissemination. So there's a public affairs operation at the State Department, and I'm sure they put out a lot of very expensive glossy publications and put a lot of resources into telling the story about the department that the department wants to tell. So I think there needs to be an assessment made of, in relation to that sort of affirmative expenditure of telling the department's story and, you know, sort of telling the nice, good story that it wants to tell. In comparison to that expenditure, how much is spent on answering requests from citizens for the information that citizens actually want to get? And I don't know of any agency that has ever done, in a public way, that kind of assessment, but I suspect it would be very telling, and I suspect that there would be a great imbalance, that the public affairs budget dwarfs the FOIA implementation budget.
And along the lines of budget and budget authority, looking at the table of organization to ensure that the information officer or the FOIA officer or the transparency officer actually has real authority and has the ability to enforce dictates with rewards or punishment that the bureaucracy can understand. Because if it's simply off in its oasis generating its studies, it will be ignored. So you need some real muscle within the organization.
I would say that, and I think those are fantastic recommendations. And in addition, just on the kind of simpler administrative level, engaging more with requesters. As I noted, one of the most frustrating experiences I had, particularly with the State Department, was filing a request and not even getting a letter, and then trying to find out what the case number is, and literally just nobody responding for 4 years, you know. So the engagement, which I know that OIP encourages, just is not there. Some agencies do that. Believe it or not, the agency that I engage with the most, which, you know, they're the nicest, is the NSA.
Because they know they'll never have to.
I was just going to say, because they constantly say, you know, like, you know, oh yeah, sure, we got it, Jason. You know, sure. But the point being that, you know, the phone calls, the emails, you know, it certainly allows me to kind of address some things. It's really funny. This, you know, if I can just digress for one moment. So the Justice Department, they have done this, you know, at least the Office of Legal Counsel. I asked for a couple of weeks ago for documents on this millennial coin, whatever it was. I asked for a legal opinion and emails and everything. They gave me a call and they said, well, if you narrow this request, we could probably get you the records this week. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I did. A day later, I got a letter from them. They said, we processed 2 pages and we're withholding everything. And I'm like, you bastards. But the point being that it was at least, able to go back and forth. So, and I think that would actually go a long way.
One other point is, if you can make and I don't know the FOIA career track, officer's track, but if you can make the FOIA officer a desirable career track with promotions and pay incentives and rewards in the sort of psychological sense. So I sometimes get the feeling that in some agencies, the FOIA officer is a dead end, a burnout, somebody who's not, it's
Right.
punishment. And if you can make it a desirable place to be to get the morale up for these poor saps, that would help.
Wasn't there? I'm sort of remembering an episode of Homeland where Carrie gets called back to Langley to do FOIA work.
Yeah. That would be a good one.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, Sean Lingus, cybersecurity reporter for FCW and Press Freedom Committee member here. Thanks for being here, everyone. My question is similar. David made the point where there's been more public attention on FOIA because of the Clinton emails, and perhaps it's a moment, I think, to seize and draw attention to it. I wanted to go off that and say, how can we as journalists kind of make sure that we don't, the picture we're all painting is one of backsliding, and it's getting worse and worse. How do we put a stop to this for the next administration? In a certain sense, journalists will always complain about FOIA process. Well, we always will. But how do we advocate for this without hurting our cause? I think back to when DOJ seized the phone records of AP a few years ago, and there was a sit-down with Holder at DOJ. Some lawyers from the press club were involved too, and I think it had some effect in sort of saying never again, hopefully. So sometimes I think the softer finesse might work better than the public campaign. I just want to get your thoughts on how do we effectively lobby for our own cause here, because I don't think we should be passive.
Well, I will leave that to the journalists, but I'll just observe as sort of a FOIA advocate and part of the community that pushes for transparency. The non-journalistic organizations often have the feeling that the journalistic organizations feel that they have a conflict of interest in lobbying or sort of taking a position on a political issue that they have sort of a professional interest in.
I think that's the problem right there, is that they're looking at it as a political issue, and certainly it is in some cases. Last year, I was invited to testify before the House, Government Oversight Committee on FOIA, and I'm a journalist. Journalists don't like to, testify about anything. But this was about FOIA. This was about how to improve it, a tool that would benefit all of us. So why not, take that opportunity and talk about it and offer some suggestions. So I think that, and it's funny because some of the journalists who were invited declined for that very reason.
Right, yeah.
But it is to me, it's not, it's a tool that we use for our work. I think that the frustration that, when a journalist will get documents maybe a year, 4 years later, it's like, this is old, throw it away. I think if more of those sort of stories, perhaps they're horror stories, were to come out, it raises awareness, and the problem is that it is the advocacy groups, the open government groups that are pushing for it, and not just for journalists, obviously, but for everyone, and not enough sort of pounding, fists by journalists. And I think that part of it is really kind of looking at it through a lens of, this is not a bad thing. It's transparency. Who's against that?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of hard power and soft power. You need people who are pounding their fist and shedding light on the horror stories. This is outrageous abuse. They're the most closed-minded administration in history, and this is what they did. But you also need Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and the National Press Club and FOIA committees to work. And in regards to journalists' testimony, the very first information subcommittee hearing that John Moss chaired in 1955, the first witness was a journalist. I mean, journalists have been were there at the very beginning of FOIA, and I don't see any reason why we can't be there right now.
Probably have time for one question or two questions if we do them back to back, and they're brief.
Hi, I'm George Mapp. I'm a journalist, freelance. Just a point that, like David said, he was talking about, FOIA and it's not so hard. You don't have to jump through hoops. And then Jason was talking about like litigation, and I've done some FOIA requests, and it's glow-marked by CIA. The FBI came back and gave me about 20 pages, but 29 were deleted. And when I did an appeal with Jason's help, I guess they recognized the language. For first it says OGA, then when they came back with the appeal, it's it's not us, the CIA that deleted it. But you guys are talking like it's normal, like to do litigation. Like, first of all, I have to file a FOIA request, which is very difficult for an independent journalist or just a layperson. Then you have to do an appeal, and the language is difficult. And then, litigation. So to file, pay like $400 just to file for a person, and then, lawyers can be $500 to $1,000 per hour for FOIA. Lawyers I investigated and spoke to several, but I just don't think it's right. I think it's frustrating. It's our information. It's free, and then we have to fight for it. And I think it's definitely that there's overclassification as well. And just to I think Michael mentioned before, like 65%. For instance, I got information back for the FBI, but like 29 pages were deleted. So they did respond to my request, but and then Jason keeps on talking about everything being redacted, and it happened to me. So I just wonder if that number is a little inflated. But my question is, like, I just think that, I don't know, I just maybe, not to be like pessimistic or negative, but I just think that it is maybe a big deal to go, to do this. I guess if you have a news organization behind you with the money, it's not such a big deal. But, I just wanted to say that.
One more question?
Yes.
Glenn Marcus, I'm with the Press Freedom Committee. Just want to make sure that everybody knows this is being not just live streamed, but it is being recorded. It will ultimately go up on our website, press.org. And it's been a great show, so I think you will look at it and spread it around. That's all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So let me just quickly say that I agree that litigation shouldn't be necessary, but unfortunately it often is. But one of the other great things about the statute is that if you sue and win and get something out of the case, the government has to pay your attorney. So that incentivizes people like me to take cases that otherwise, might not be feasible. So I often take cases that, are just such obvious slam dunks that the agency's position was so ridiculous that, it's worth taking on. So that's another positive thing about the statute, that it does do that.
Not to be a Debbie Downer, but on the other hand, I was talking to Jefferson Morley, who's a writer, does a lot of work on the CIA, and his case was being argued at one of the local courts. First file, it was a FOIA lawsuit filed 11 years ago. He prevailed, but the question now is, was the response in the public interest, or words to that effect? The CIA says no, it was not in the public interest. So yes, he won the lawsuit, but now has been fighting for years to get the attorney's fees.
But that's his lawyer's problem. I mean, whether the lawyer's going to end up having worked for free or going to get paid. But he got his stuff, so
It's definitely an investment of time. I mean, it's frustrating. It's tedious. The payoff could be huge, though. You never know. So you have to sort of gamble with that. For years ago, I would file all these requests knowing that eventually, there will be this pipeline built, and I'll get some releases on a regular basis, and that's certainly what happens now. Yeah, going through the appeals, and I think there's this idea that your appeal has to be like 10 pages. It doesn't, because nobody's going to sit there and say, "Oh, boy, convincing argument." This is not a legal thing. I appeal the integrity of the search, and the redactions are improper. Thank you very much. So,
Excellent,
it's just, that's, sometimes what you have to end up going through.
And the other thing I meant to say is that was the point of OGIS. I mean,
Right.
a lot of the journalist organizations were very supportive of the creation of an ombudsman's office precisely for that reason,
Right.
that a lot of journalists don't have the resources or the wherewithal to litigate. So, that's potentially another option.
And certainly a good first avenue to think about. They might be able to help you, although the agencies you mentioned are not real game players.
Yeah, I would just, if I can just add one thing, I go in, when I file a request with the FBI, with the CIA, or the NSA, I'm going into that knowing that I'm not getting anything, and that I'm getting ready to litigate. There's just no way, I mean, it takes the NSA a year to give me their FOIA logs, but that's a different thing. But knowing that these are highly classified, materials for the most part, or at least, they have the CIA Act and the National Security Act, which essentially exempts them from FOIA. So knowing that, if you're filing a request for the drone memo, this memo that was used to target assassination memo, you have to go into that knowing that this is not, you have to dig in for a very, very lengthy battle fight. And I personally am aware of that, and I think that requesters, with all due respect, should be aware that if you're going to ask the CIA for something, just be aware that they're not going to be willing to give it up.
I think the name you're looking for is Anwar al-Awlaki.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. Yeah. Right. And Samir Khan and a bunch of others. So. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming out and to all of our panelists for this really engaging discussion.
A couple very short housekeeping things. Somebody did drop their blue phone. Is this anybody's?
It's mine.
Okay, excellent. And then I just wanted to say thank you to the Press Freedom Committee members that helped put this event together. It was a team effort. Our Vice Committee chairs, Danny and Sean, played a big role, as did Glenn. Thank you all. We here at the Press Freedom Committee take FOIA very seriously. We want to continue having events like this and hopefully future trainings. So please pay attention to the space where you found out about this event, because more will be coming in the months ahead. Thank you.
To me, and I filed a FOIA request with the FBI. About 3 months after I filed that FOIA request, I get a phone call from this guy's wife. She says, "Jason, the FBI is here. There's a special agent here, and they're asking about you." And I said, "What? What are they asking about?" "They're asking about your FOIA." And I'm like, "What? That's crazy." So I filed a FOIA on myself for everything that was said about me by the FBI at this particular place on that day. 6 months later, the FBI turned over 3 pages, and sure enough, they sent out a special agent to investigate, my FOIA request, and which I've never heard of before. And they interrogated this guy about what he told me and whether I forged his name on the privacy waiver. So it was, I went to battle with the FBI over that, and eventually they turned over all the documents. But that was fun. That was my first sort of meta FOIA experience. I do a lot of meta FOIAs, so I knew things would be a lot of fun after filing that one.
Okay, David?
So I'll mention my first FOIA experience and one of the more interesting. So the first one was, we were talking about 1966 and the passage of FOIA. So a year later, in 1967, this was a journalistic crowd will appreciate this, and some of you might remember this, that the first big expose of CIA wrongdoing or CIA controversy was Ramparts magazine disclosed the fact that the CIA had been secretly funding the National Student Association. since its creation in the early 50s. It was a big scandal. President Johnson created a special commission to investigate this. And anyway, this was sort of the first big controversy involving the CIA. So fast forward to the early 80s, I had just gotten out of law school and come to Washington, and I knew people who were at the successor organization of the National Student Association, which was called the United States Student Association. And they had made a FOIA request sort of trying to learn the organization's secret history. So they made a request to the FBI and the CIA and basically got stonewalled. So they approached me and asked me if I could file a FOIA lawsuit for them. And I had never done it, but I got some guidance by some attorneys at Public Citizen Litigation Group. And I filed the case, and we ended up getting a fair amount of information. The recent footnote to this is that all these many years later, a lot of the material that we got through that lawsuit has contributed to a book that was just recently published last year, detailing, sort of going through this history of the CIA's relationship with the Student Association by a...
campaigned on and came into office promising to be the most open and transparent administration the country's ever known. So we have a great panel pulled together here tonight to explore the issue. To my left, we have David Sobel from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. David is senior counsel in the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Washington, D.C. office, where he directs the organization's FOIA Litigation for Accountable Government, or FLAG, project. David's handled numerous cases seeking the disclosure of government documents on privacy policy, including electronic surveillance, encryption controls, and airline passenger screening initiatives. Then we have Mike Doyle from McClatchy. Mike is the legal affairs correspondent for McClatchy's Washington Bureau, covering the Supreme Court and other federal courts, and so he had a busy day today. He's worked as a reporter for the Bureau since 1988. And then to the far left is Jason Leopold from Vice News. Jason is an Emmy-nominated investigative reporter from Vice News, where he covers national security. Politico has identified him as perhaps the most prolific Freedom of Information Act requester. He has sued the FBI and the Department of Defense and forced the agencies to change their FOIA policies. He filed the FOIA request that forced the State Department to release Secretary Clinton's emails, which we'll discuss on the panel. And he forced the NSA for the first time to release all of the financial disclosure forms of its top officials. As Rachel mentioned, we had also hoped to have OJIS Director James Holzer with us tonight, but as a result of the Metro, he wasn't able to make it. We have done our best to try to incorporate some of those perspectives into the dialogue tonight, but if anyone has positive FOIA experiences that they'd like to share, please shout out. We'd love to hear it. One way I thought we'd get to know all the panelists is I've asked each panelist to think about what their first or most interesting FOIA experience was, so that you understand their backgrounds a little bit more. So Mike, what do you have to say?
Well, my first FOIA experience, not technically my first, but my first meaningful one, was for a former California congressman who passed away. And when he passed away, I figured the FBI would have a file on him. His name was John Moss, and he was the author of the Freedom of Information Act. When he died in 1997, I filed a FOIA. A year or so later, I got the response from the FBI, and it was entertaining. It was filled with nuggets. There was a March 31st, 1960 FBI memo that said, our relations have not been favorable with Congressman Moss. And there was a 1959 memo that pointed out that the congressman, this was before FOIA had even passed, but the FBI said the congressman was going to be speaking at the University of Arizona, probably would be saying things antithetical to the Bureau's interests, and it would be good to get an invitation to speak and counter Moss. So that was, as I say, not my first FOIA, but it was the first one that opened my eyes to how fun this act can be. In terms of the most interesting FOIA, it's like choosing your favorite child, but I would say one from 2007, and I'll preface it to go back to a point which Christine made, prior to Johnson signing the act, his advisors, Secretary of HEW, Cyrus Vance, State Department, all recommended that he not sign it and raised serious concerns. The State Department sent a memo saying that if you open up access to information, it would open and encourage, quote, fishing expeditions by those motivated by nothing more than an idle whim or a capricious curiosity. So it was on a day when I was filled with capricious curiosity in 2007 that I filed a FOIA request with the Department of the Army. A Laotian general named Vang Pao had passed away. He had fought with the CIA in the Vietnam War. He died. His supporters wanted him buried at Arlington. He was denied that burial right. It became a little bit of a controversy. And literally, it was a slow day at the office, and I was just kind of curious about Arlington cemetery burial exemptions. So I filed a FOIA as an idle whim. Several weeks later, got the response, the best part of which was the lobbying campaign that it revealed by Hollywood's lobbyist, Jack Valente, big power player in Washington at the time, World War II veteran, desperate to get buried at Arlington. And the correspondence that I obtained showed how he was writing letters and emails and having lunches and leaning on members of Congress and sending notes to Rummy, Secretary Rumsfeld, talking about the importance of it. And it led to this lead. I still like this lead. Jack Valente won his final and most heartfelt lobbying victory when he was lowered into the ground at Arlington National Cemetery. So that was a case. I love that FOIA request because it was completely idle. It was simple curiosity, and I came up with something that was kind of fun.
Fantastic. What about you, Jason?
I would say that the most interesting FOIA experience I had, which opened my eyes up to how fun this would be, I found out many years ago, I guess 5 years ago for me is many years ago, but 5 years ago, that the first high-value detainee captured after 9/11, his name is Abu Zubaydah. He has a brother who lives in the United States, who lives in Florida. And so I was trying to think about a profile I wanted to write about this high-value detainee who was first held at a CIA black site, then it was held at Guantanamo. I couldn't believe he had a brother here. I reached out to his brother, flew out to Florida to meet with him, hoping that he would provide me with some insight into this brother, Abu Zubaydah, who was in Guantanamo, because we really didn't know too much about him. We only knew what the government was telling us. And then I found out, and after speaking with him, that the guy in Florida had just had his own fascinating story to tell. So I convinced him to sign over a privacy waiver.
A writer named Karen Paget. The book is called Patriotic Betrayal, and it relies on a lot of this material. So it's sort of a reminder that this process takes a long time, and it wasn't so much that the government took a long time, but the writing of the history took a long time. So you've got to be very persistent with these things. So probably the most interesting, or one of the most interesting, was a few years ago I was contacted by a writer in California named William Volman, who I was not familiar with. But apparently he's a well-regarded writer. His stuff is a little strange, but he's won the National Book Award, and he's a solid guy, but a little bit on the edge, let's say. So he told me that he had made requests with the CIA and the FBI for his own files, and he was sure that they must have things. He couldn't really articulate any reason, but he was just sure of this. And this is something that I hear many times from many people. When you're a lawyer who specializes in FOIA, you get contacted by lots of people who are sure that the FBI has massive files on them. So, I said, well, okay, if you're able to, if your publisher is able to devote some fees to this and you really want to pursue it, we can pursue it. So we did, and to make a long story short, he ended up discovering the fact that he had been a Unabomber suspect and had a massive FBI file, and he ended up writing a very interesting article for Harper's about this experience and discovering that he had been under suspicion and under surveillance for several years. So that was sort of an experience that taught me to not be so skeptical when people come to me and say they think there's something to be gotten.
Great. So for my part, I was involved with the Withers litigation, where the Memphis Commercial Appeal sued for access to Ernest Withers' FBI file. Ernest Withers was a civil rights era photographer who was very close to the civil rights movement, and he was also an FBI informant. And the FBI fought us tooth and nail until one day the Judge Amy Berman Jackson called us into open court and asked the FBI on the record whether they were really prepared to litigate whether the surveillance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was for a law enforcement purpose. And because she didn't think that they actually were prepared to do that, and the law does in fact require it. And after that, the parties were able to craft a pretty workable settlement with sort of utilizing the National Archives and Records Administration to help release the documents, which was ultimately.
So everyone, we'll go ahead and get started because we have an excellent panel and we're going to have more than enough to talk about, so I don't want to delay in kicking off what's going to be a great discussion. My name is Rachel Oswald. Welcome to the National Press Club for those of you that are our guests. I am the vice chair of the Freedom of the Press Committee, and the committee every year likes to put together a slate of programming celebrating freedom of information in honor of Sunshine Week. So this is the final event of 3 events we did this week. We're going to be looking at freedom of information from the federal level, examining how well the Obama administration has done. Regrettably, we were going to be joined by the Obama administration's FOIA Ombudsman, Director James Holzer, but the metro shutdown did not allow him to come here. So regrettably, he's not going to join us, but I want you to know that we did try to have the administration represented, and so it was a good faith effort, but we hope to maybe do an event with the director or somebody else from his office in the future, and of course we will advertise that when it happens. So if you want to live tweet the event, by all means, the hashtag is NPCLive. We're also webcasting this, and I believe that's it for announcements. I'll just let our moderator, Christine Waltz, take it over and introduce the panel.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And thanks everyone for coming out and braving the traffic tonight. I apologize that we're getting started a few minutes late. It was wretched out there. As Rachel mentioned, my name's Christine Walls. I'm an associate at Holland & Knight in the firm's national media practice, and part of my practice includes access issues and representing reporters and news organizations with access issues. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel discussion. I think, as everyone knows, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Act, and President Johnson notoriously and reluctantly signed the bill in 1966 without holding a signing ceremony because he didn't want to draw public attention to the bill.
He wasn't necessarily in this photo pondering it, right?
No.
Okay.
This is
That's what it
illustrative.
looks like when I send my FOIAs in. I imagine.
It's illustrative. He didn't want to draw public attention to the bill. Notes from his files indicate that he edited the signing statement to try to limit the reach of the law. So, for example, he revised a sentence that said, democracy works best when people know what their government is doing, to instead read, democracy works best when people have all the information that the security of the nation will permit. So I think it's fair to say that since it was passed, this law has always had its critics within every presidential administration. And as Rachel mentioned, tonight our panel will focus on the state of FOIA at the end of the Obama administration, which, as we all